The war in Iran continues to keep the Middle East, and indeed the world, on edge. In Washington, the president changes his mind on a daily basis. The Strait of Hormuz exists in a state of superflux, simultaneously open and closed. In Lebanon, Israel's ceasefire continues to kill scores of people as the Netanyahu government appears to reach out with one hand and strike down with the other. In the Gulf, the assessments begin, determining what has been damaged and what the final bill will be, both financially and diplomatically. That is, assuming that the war will not return. These are the headlines, but turn a few pages and there's another story that has been sowing strife and misery for years, and while attention is elsewhere, has been ramping up in both ferocity and brutality. Settlers attacked the school and began firing live ammunition at it. The army then immediately joined them, opening fire as we were trying to evacuate the students. Jihad was killed while attempting to get his brothers, cousins, and other students out. He was shot by settlers in the army, who also fired tear gas and stun grenades. The occupied West Bank is under attack. It has been under attack for years, decades even. But the intensity is rising, and fast. Attacks by Jewish settlers who commit crimes with complete impunity are daily. And every day brings new legal diktats from the Netanyahu government that stifle life, impose fresh restrictions, and crush Palestinians. At the start of April, it was announced that the Israeli government had approved a host of new settlements in the West Bank. On April 21st, a handful of EU countries stepped forward and tried to achieve some level of accountability for Israel's continued crimes. Spain's Foreign Minister, José Manuel Álvarez, addressed reporters. Spain, together with Slovenia and Ireland, has requested that today there be a discussion and debate on the suspension of the association agreement between the European Union and Israel, based on Article 2, which states that the European Union can only have a relationship with Israel on the basis of respect for human rights. This week, what is happening in the West Bank? How is Israel creating the conditions for annexation? What is the EU Association Agreement? And is the tide in Europe moving against Israel's dream of a West Bank takeover? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. At the start of April, it was reported that the Israeli Security Cabinet had voted to approve the establishment of 34 new settlements. While the approval was made public in April, the Israeli NGO Peace Now claimed that the decision was made on March 25th, but kept secret. In response to the announcement, the EU issued a stern rebuke. In a statement, they said, "The European Union strongly condemns Israel's unilateral action aiming to expand its presence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on 19th of July 2024 declared to be unlawful, and urges the government of Israel to reverse these decisions, to abide by its obligations and international law, and to protect the Palestinian population of the occupied territories. We equally condemn the continued and growing settler violence against Palestinian civilians." Powerful stuff there from the 27-nation bloc. But similar to previous statements by the EU, it did not dissuade the Israeli government from its plans. In response, a handful of European nations, including Spain, Ireland, Belgium, and Slovenia, called for the association agreement between the EU and Israel to be suspended. Speaking to voters in Andalusia, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said, "We are people who are friends of the people of Israel. But no, we do not agree with the actions being taken by their government, and a government that violates international law and therefore violates the principles and values of the European Union cannot be a partner of the European Union. The association agreement between the European Union and Israel is effectively a trade deal. Its ramifications are significant for Israel and its economy. More on that later. First, the settlements.
It was an approval of 34 settlements in the West Bank in early April 2026.
This is Yada Asi, Assistant Professor of Global Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central Florida and co-director of the Palestine Program for Health and Human Rights.
Now, some of this was the establishment of new settlements, and some of this was the legalization of settlement outposts that had already been established. And this is just kind of giving them basically approval from the Israeli government.
Of the 34 settlements given approval by the Israeli government, 24 are listed as new settlements, while the remaining 10 are former illegal outposts.
Even by the standards of the Israeli government, these randomly established settlement outposts are technically illegal. And so what the Israeli government can sometimes do is just retroactively approve them, which for all intents and purposes is basically, approval of that new settlement.
This kind of retroactive legalization is a common practice of the Israeli government. It's worth adding that when these outposts are illegally established, even under Israeli law, the Israeli state will not take steps to shut them down or ensure the land is returned to the rightful Palestinian owners. The establishment of these 34 new settlements is a blow to the Palestinians in their struggle against the illegal settler movement. It's a struggle that the Palestinians of the West Bank have been facing for many years, but also one that is getting worse.
This is the largest number of settlements approved at once, according to reports. And since late 2022, we've seen this expansion policy that has seen over that time 103 settlements approved. So the 34 new settlements from April is nearly 6 times the number that we've seen since the Oslo Accords. So this is a continuation of a policy that the Israeli government has taken in earnest over the past 4-ish years, but this is a exponential increase, even by that measure. So we're seeing this kind of settlement contingent of the Israeli government now, which has multiple ministers and positions of power that live in settlements. This is a real acknowledgement by them that the settlement expansion is a central part of this government's goals.
As the number of illegal settlements in the West Bank has risen, so too has the number of settlers. With these settlers comes settler violence.
So settlement violence or settler violence has always been a thing. This has always, since this, since Oslo, since I was a child, I remember that there would be, some roads that you knew just not to travel certain times of days, or you would see groups of settlers on the side of roads, waving flags, singing songs. This has always existed, but we have absolutely seen an unprecedented increase in settler violence in the past few years.
The West Bank is not a big place, and the new settlements are getting squeezed into land which is already inhabited, pushing hostile, armed settlers closer and closer to Palestinian homes and land.
So when you're seeing so many new settlements being built and being expanded, the result of that is that they are getting closer and closer to Palestinian roads, Palestinian cities and towns. And so this just increases the ability for settlers to leave their area, come down to the roads where they know Palestinians drive, or directly enter villages or cities and be violent, either towards people or by uprooting trees, killing livestock. We've seen reports of that, dumping sewage and trash, and of course, violence.
And the number of reported incidents is rising.
Within just the first 3 months of 2026, we have seen more displacement due to settler violence, settler raids, and settlers occupying people's homes than we saw in all of 2025. It's April? So we're not even halfway through the year, and we've seen more displacement due to settler violence than we saw all of last year. And last year itself was an unprecedented year. So the UN tells us that as of this month, we're seeing an average of 6 to 7 attacks daily. And this is attacks that are reported. They are also using different tactics. We're seeing settlers now having more firearms that are, in some cases, supplied by the Israeli government. We're seeing reports of more activities like sexual violence from settlers against Palestinians.
There are appalling stories coming from the West Bank. Families' homes shot at and set on fire, people beaten and sexually assaulted, farmland destroyed, and livestock taken or killed.
Literally, they will walk into someone's home in some of these areas, especially in the more rural Bedouin communities. And in some of the, we're not talking about necessarily in the big towns, but in the smaller villages in Area B or some of the communities in Area C, they will walk into a home, force the family to leave, and they will just stay in that home. This is not a complicated, endeavor. They will just literally kick people out of their homes.
We could pick out individual stories of horror and abuses, but settler violence isn't really about individual stories. It's a story of abuses that are widespread and systematic. This isn't just violence against a person. It's violence against an entire people.
So they are approving settlements both in ways to fracture and fragment the West Bank, and they are utilizing this settler violence to further, push Palestinians, especially out of areas B and C. They're not just taking homes now, they're taking people's farms, they're taking people's infrastructure, they're taking wells, they're taking, so this is a concerted effort that it's not just violence for violence's sake, as I think sometimes people might assume. I mean, of course, there is that aspect of it, but it is a systematic violence with the explicit purpose to kick Palestinians off land and take that land. And so we have to see it in that framing, right? It is violence, but it is also violence with a political purpose.
To add insult to the injury of settler violence, these crimes are committed with impunity.
Almost no settler has been held accountable for violence. I think Yesh Din, which is an Israeli NGO, reports that only 2% of investigations into settler violence result in indictments. And that is when there's investigations. How many incidents like this happen and absolutely nothing is investigated?
Israel has failed to convict a single settler for killing Palestinians since 2020.
One thing that advocates for Palestinians and Palestinians have long, I think, suffered from is that the international community, quote unquote, whatever that means at this point, they are unwilling to make to recognize the implicit endorsement of some of these actions, right? It's always when we see soldiers in the Gaza Strip doing something that is so, overt or so despicable or just, so inhumane through photos, through videos, through testimonies from the soldiers, they're bad apples. They are exceptions, right? Those are radicals. They are not representative of the military. And we see the same thing with settlers. They are, that's how they are talked about. But when it happens over and over and over for months, years, and we see no effort to curtail it, and we are now at a time when it is more explicit, more violent than it ever has been, it's it's baffling that any well-intentioned person could not say that this is not endorsed by the state.
Palestinians have little to no recourse when it comes to redress for violence committed against them by settlers. And increasingly, the violence is being facilitated by the Israeli army, who will ensure that violent settlers are escorted and protected by armed soldiers. As Palestinians face the ever-increasing encroachment of illegal settlements and the daily violence perpetrated by settlers, they are also being increasingly targeted by Israeli courts and the Israeli legal system.
So, earlier this year, Israel repealed a restriction on selling land in the West Bank to non-Palestinians, which makes it easier for Israeli citizens to buy land. And then also, Israel has other tactics like deeming land archaeological sites, like they've done with Sebastia near Nablus, or military zones. This is the This is the same tactic that they've used to deem half of Gaza off limits to Palestinians. They will just say, this swath of land is a military zone. This swath of land is an archaeological site. We need this land to build new settler-only roads. Again, the West Bank is very small. So all of these forces combined, even if they're difficult to quantify, the manifestation is quite obvious, which is Palestinians are getting shoved into smaller and smaller areas where they can live. You're seeing so many people leave the rural areas of the West Bank and have to move to family in cities like Nablus, like Ramallah.
Previously, only individuals registered as living in the West Bank or companies registered in the West Bank could purchase land. It is feared that this law is open to abuse by settlers and provide further means for them to illegally seize Palestinian land. And another recent legal effort by Israel is clearing the land, which settlers could then buy.
What we have seen, especially since February of this year, is that Israel has implemented a new land registration process in Area C that requires Palestinians to provide documentation of their ownership. And this includes deeds from the Ottoman era. So these are Palestinians that have been on that land through the British Mandate, before the occupation, before all of this, or their families have. So if you cannot show your deed from the Ottoman Empire, basically, you don't have proof that you own that land. Or, you have to show proof that, through tax records, through cultivation, throughout the land, to prove your ownership of your land to this occupying power. If you don't have that proof, which many people don't for any number of reasons, the land, or the state has indicated that they will now seize that land. There's like a mix of legal and illegal ways that this is happening.
For many families, asking them to find legal documents issued by an empire that no longer exists, that date back over 100 years, is wholly unrealistic. Israel's far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, described the move as part of, quote, the settler revolution to control all our lands, end quote. Smotrich himself is a settler. Requesting arcane documents to prove that your home is yours is yet another tool recently created by Israel, devised to take Palestinian land. On top of all of this, destruction in the West Bank is on the rise. Palestinians must seek permission from the occupying Israeli Authority if they want to build a permanent structure. However, according to the UN, between 2016 and 2021, less than 1% of applications by Palestinians to build in Area C of the West Bank, or East Jerusalem as well, were approved. It leaves Palestinians in a difficult situation. The population is growing, but the space is shrinking. If you need more room, you have to build it. Or if you need an upgrade on your farm, you have to build it. But if Israel finds a structure built without permission,
and then Israel will come in and say, you got to move this, you got to destroy this, we didn't approve this. And so what ends up happening is they will give the family a notice, and the family either has to pay essentially tens of thousands of dollars to Israel to come with their bulldozers and destroy their home, or they have to destroy it themselves. So in 2021, 913 structures were demolished.
These destructions in 2021 were seen as a significant escalation.
In 2024, 1,769 structures were demolished. According to this UN dashboard that I'm looking at, in 2026 so far, it's late April, we've seen 445 structures demolished, and it has displaced about 700 people.
It's a grossly unfair system that is weighted heavily against Palestinians.
Palestinians can technically file petitions in Israeli courts to stop demolition orders, but as I'm sure you and your listeners can imagine, This is rarely, successful to the point where it's almost, people who receive these notices almost never will engage in those processes because they kind of see the writing on the wall. Why go through a long, lengthy, stressful, humiliating, expensive, perhaps, court case when you know the outcome is going to be the same? And then, there have been some pushes by humanitarian agencies and NGOs, including Israeli NGOs, to support these legal challenges. But this is happening so quickly. You would have to have basically an entire, group of lawyers that could just continuously be working on these cases at a daily basis.
The illegal Israeli occupation of the West Bank makes life for Palestinians dangerous and fraught with unwinnable legal issues. Effectively, the stage is set for someone, or a powerful group of people, to step in and say enough.
Commissioner, today we are very clear. We need to, as an EU, uphold our fundamental values, and we need to be clear for countries that we associate with, where we have agreements with, that they are upholding those fundamental values and laws. Israel has.
In April, a group of nations decided that action had to be taken. Spain, Ireland, Slovenia and Belgium called for the EU-Israel Association Agreement to be suspended.
So the EU-Israel Association Agreement was actually signed in 1995, and it entered in force since the 2000s, right? And this is probably the date that you, and the year that you find most across the literature.
This is Isabel Ruck, Head of Research and Scientific Cooperation at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Paris.
And it is kind of the legal bedrock, actually, of the European Union's relationship with Israel. This agreement governs trade relations between EU member states and Israel. And it is not really a free trade agreement, but rather, I would say, a more modest economic partnership, very similar to those that actually exist also with other countries.
The association agreement is designed to ease the wheels of trade and cooperation between Israel and the EU.
According to Article number 1 of this agreement, it is there to develop basically political and also economic relations between the European Union and Israel. And this mainly so through the expansion of trade, but also gradual liberalization of public procurement procedures, for instance, and also the free movement of capital. So in a simple word, it is there to encourage regional cooperation with a view to consolidating also peaceful coexistence.
But the agreement is not a free hand for Israel. There are conditions.
And the point of contention is really Article 2, because Article 2 of this association agreement really calls for the respect for human rights and democratic principles, which should actually be the guide to the policy, both on the side of Israel, but also on the side of the EU. And the countries that you have mentioned, that are Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, and a couple of others, that actually have argued that Israel's action in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, which various other international bodies have also characterized as potential war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law, really constitute a kind of material breach of this Article number 2.
It was on this point that the dissenting EU nations sought to suspend the agreement. The EU nations met on April 21st, but ultimately the bid to suspend the agreement was blocked by Germany and Italy. For the suspension to be agreed upon, it would have required a unanimous vote. And while Italy has made some recent revisions to its relationship with Israel, notably cancelling the automatic renewal of arms agreement, they are still close, but not as close as Germany, who are fierce in their defence of Israel.
I think indeed this unanimity principle that the European Council has is a barrier, is a very high bar. I don't think that we will see this collective or block-wide suspension of the association agreement happen in the future, right? You said you have countries such as Germany, but also Czech Republic and some others that have a very, I would say, protective relationship with Israel.
In truth, while a noble effort, the prospect that Germany was going to be voting against Israel's interest was low to zero, ensuring that efforts were going to fail. That doesn't mean that EU nations can't do anything. They can still take individual action.
There's also the example of Ireland that is interesting to mention. You have the Israeli settlements bill of 2025. The Irish government seeks really to criminalize the imports of goods that are produced in illegal settlements. And the Irish government was able to actually justify this move by citing the 2024 ICG advisory opinion that states have the legal obligation to ensure not to provide economic aid to the occupation. So this is one example, really to show that moving forward with trade restrictions on a national basis is possible, right?
Slovenia too has engaged in individual action, prohibiting the importing, exporting and transit of Israeli arms to and from Israel.
Critiques will argue it's not a big deal, right? Because it's much more a symbolic action, because Slovenia has not really issued any arms export permits since October 2023. But it still has a symbolic, I would say, a meaning, because this move that Slovenia has undertaken could potentially incentivize other European member states to follow suit, right? And we have seen this also both in the Netherlands, but also Belgium. Other countries have partly suspended their arms equipment and trade with Israel, while others, and here's the case of Germany, have absolutely not moved forward on this stage yet.
Countries like Slovenia, Spain and Belgium have seen and are seeing the actions of Israel in the West Bank, as well as Israel's genocide in Gaza and its attacks on Lebanon. As governments, they have expressed their condemnation of these illegal actions. But they are also reacting to a growing sentiment among Europeans who are shocked and appalled by the actions of Israel and angered by the thought of their countries supporting these actions.
And when your citizens are no longer in line with your government, it eventually also translates in the polls. And national governments do not have really this interest in keeping unhappy their populations. So this is why I do think that this popular pressure, this bottom-up organization will eventually be the main driver of the contestation movement against the association agreement that the EU has with Israel. There is a legitimacy trap, right? And I think that the EU can't really ignore indefinitely the fact that you have more and more individuals actually that are not in line with the actions that are being taken in Brussels.
A YouGov poll from June 2025 indicated that support for Israel was at a historic low in Western Europe. Fewer than 1 in 5 respondents across France, Germany, Italy, Spain and Denmark expressed a favourable view of Israel. And these growing sentiments were also seen in the response to a European citizen initiative, which calls on the EU to demand a full suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement in view of Israel's violations of human rights, and which so far has been signed by over 1 million people. There is a growing constituency inside Europe that wants action, but the actions that the EU is actually capable of delivering is diminishing. Say hello to the capability expectation gap. It's a concept that was coined by the British political scientist Christopher Hill in the early 1990s.
What Hill was trying to do was to describe the distance between what the world and what the EU citizens expect from European institutions as, I would say, a global power, and what its internal and legal political structures actually allow the EU to do. So at the core, actually, of Christopher Hill's argument was that he considers that the European Union was actually being talked up by its own leaders and also by the international community as a major global power, as a major normative power, while the actual tools for this action actually remained limited and fragmented. Hill warned us that if this gap between the capability on the one hand and the expectations would grow too wide, this could eventually lead to what he calls public disillusionment, international irrelevance of the EU, and also more internal frictions and dissent that could actually arise.
European nations know what happens when things are not normal. They know what happens when human rights and democratic principles are eroded. As an organisation, it wants to be normal, and it wants everyone else to be normal.
In the case of the renegotiation of the EU association agreement with Israel, I really think that one of the key points that often is referred on is really this idea of Europe is this normative power, and this kind of normative power has completely vanished in this current setting, right? Because of this Article 2 that we have already talked upon, right? That the EU has signed, that Israel has signed, and which clearly states that the relation is built on the respect of human rights and on the respect of democratic principles. And that if the European Union was this normative power that it is supposed to present to the world, then it would actually need to take action in this sense and not violate its own principles. So there is where this kind of expectation steps in, because there is a high expectation that the EU will use its position as Israel's greatest trading partner to really exert pressure on the Israeli government. But while these expectations are very high, the EU's actually capability to change this legal relationship with Israel is kind of hamstrung by its own governance structures, right? And we have talked about this unanimity requirement. And of course, and this is where I would say Hill is right, these legal or these structural constraints that the EU has are now giving actually rise to those internal divisions and let the European Union, in the eyes of the world, really appear as ineffective, fragmented, and nothing more than a bunch actually of nation states that cannot come to consensus on a norm that they have actually all signed on, right?
Today, the gap is big and growing. So how do you narrow it or bridge it?
I think to bridge this gap at the time that we are talking will be very difficult, right? I only see two ways of doing so. The first one is simply to say that the European Union needs to respect and live up to its own norms. This is one way of bridging the gap. And the second one, but probably very difficult to go down this way, is to reconsider the voting system, to move away from this unanimity principle and move towards more qualified majority voting, where you would need only 15 out of the 25 member states to vote, but of course these member states would have to be representative of 65% of the European population, and this is where you said, of course, then you would need bigger countries and probably also Germany. And to what extent would Germany do this? That's a big question that I don't have the answer to, right?
Discontent is growing among the population and even among lawmakers. But currently, the system means that changing the status quo is very difficult, and the EU's relationship looks here to stay. But why have the relationship in the first place? The EU is Israel's biggest trading partner. In 2024, 34.2% of Israel's imports came from the EU, and 28.8% of its exports went to Europe. but Israel only represents 0.8% of the EU's trade. It's the bloc's 31st largest trading partner. To lose this would be an economic dent to the EU, but a dent that, in all probability, could be buffed out. It's clear what Israel gets out of the deal: trade and diplomatic cover. But what's the EU getting out of this, apart from being tied to a genocidal apartheid regime? As Isabel Ruck puts it, there are few main areas beyond trade that bind the EU to Israel.
In terms of innovation, integration, I think this is something that many people actually don't know about the EU and Israel. They really operate within a shared research and development ecosystem. You have European industrial giants such as Siemens, such as Airbus. They really utilize Israel as a I would say, high velocity laboratory, right? Especially for deep tech, for artificial intelligence now more and more as well. And Israel's status as also this non-EU associated country on the Europe's Horizon programs, which is actually the world's largest civil research fund, signifies also that the EU views Israeli intellectual capital as indispensable to its own technological sovereignty, right? So there's really a strong link on research, innovation that needs to be taken into consideration to better understand the relation between the EU and Israel.
Technology. Israel and the EU share research and innovation, which helps boost the status of European tech brands worldwide. Also, intelligence.
You have, I would say, a high asymmetry intelligence sharing here, because Israel is definitely the country that offers most of its intelligence data for Europe. It serves, if you wish, as a primary source both for signal intelligence, but also for human intelligence, especially when it comes to surveying non-state actors. And I'm thinking here, of course, more about terrorist groups such as ISIS, such as Al-Qaeda, but also on Hezbollah. And if you know, especially taking the example of Germany, Germans' obsession also with Hezbollah networks, especially in Berlin, you probably better understand why this information, intelligence information, is seen as really so much needed on the European side. So I don't think they will actually want to move back on that, right?
Intelligence units, such as the Israeli Unit 8200, feeds intelligence to the EU about terrorist threats. For Europe, this is worth keeping Israel around for. On top of these security considerations, there is energy security.
I would say Israel offers for Europe here a way to distance itself a little bit from maybe the US, but also from Russia, especially with the project of the Eastern Mediterranean corridor. So, for instance, you have projects such as the EastMed pipeline, but also the Euro-Asia interconnector, which on the energy side of things really try to integrate the Leviathan gas field, which is in front of Israel and Lebanon, into the European energy grid. And you also have another big project that is currently in the making, which is the IMEC, so the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, where Israel is basically also a kind of a nodal point in this project, and more specifically the port of Haifa.
The IMEC is effectively a grand trade route and economic integration agreement. It's designed to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative.
And last but not least, and this is something that probably you've heard most, is this idea that still, I would say, is subsisting in the European diplomatic category, this idea that Israel is a democratic outpost in the region, right? That's very much realist perspective in international relations, that the EU considers Israel really as this pivotal state, the only democracy in the region, and that for that matter, the EU should continue to work with it. I mean, this is now very much questionable, especially after what has happened. I don't know whether we want to continue to call Israel a democratic state, but I just want to say that this kind of discourse is still present, and as long as the discourse is present, it kind of legitimizes, certain actions and the persistence of these actions as well.
Israel is not the only democracy in the Middle East, and its democratic credentials are questionable at the moment. But it's an idea that the EU is holding on to. Denial is not just a river in Egypt. If you look solely at the trade from Israel to the EU, it's pretty negligible. But for many EU lawmakers, they're looking at these fields of research and innovation, security and energy, and saying it's worth tying themselves to Israel over. But the EU has been in a similar situation with different countries when it's decided against the occupying power. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the EU was quick to condemn the actions as an illegal occupation and cut ties with Russia. There are very few lawmakers in the EU questioning that decision. But there is a growing number asking why the EU has not taken a similar action when it comes to Israel, who are also engaging in an illegal occupation.
It opens a question, and I would even call it a moral schism between European member states, right? There is really this questioning of what's really the identity of the European Union. Is it this kind of normative power that the Union wanted itself to kind of represent? And what we are witnessing now is that this normative power is kind of dwindling away, or it is, I would say, used in double standard way. To say it in a friendly way, I think that what we have seen is that international law for the European Union can be modular, right? It can be applicable when the aggressor is considered to be a rival, in the case of Russia, but it can also be negotiable when the actor seems to be a strategic partner, and this is the case we're looking at here now with Israel, right? This has really opened the question of double standards, and it has clearly marked also the European public opinion. This is probably a long-term brand mark for the European Union as well, because what we have seen, for instance, in George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq, the international public opinion has really shown that this was not followed suit, that it was something illegal. And I think that something similar is happening here. The public opinion really has declared, right? And you see this also through the protest movements that we had with students. The public opinion really has declared that this is not legal, what is going on, and that the European normative power here is flawed.
The recent declaration that EU nations were seeking to suspend the association agreement with Israel was a promising development. But it failed. And sadly, it will continue to fail, while the EU maintains its current voting principles. It also showed that for some EU nations, there is a limit. Some nations were willing to push back against a system of violence and dispossession. But the EU needs to take more action. The EU should have taken action a long time ago. It can be the normative force for good that it was designed to be, but it must act fast. It must act before it's too late. Final words to Yara Assi.
There is a lot of different mechanisms that the EU can play, and I do think we're seeing a fracture between how the EU sees its goals internationally versus how the US sees its goals internationally because of the current administration in the US. I do think the EU is beginning to recognize that they need to have their own foreign policy, that they can't just echo or support whatever the United States wants, because increasingly that is seemingly against what the EU purports to be for. But again, this can't be a process that takes a decade. Oh, let's figure out, that is too late. We are already basically too late for many things. I mean, people that have been killed, land that has been lost, trees that have been uprooted, Palestinians that have been, forced to leave their homes or leave the territories entirely. For a lot of those people, it is already too late. It is a system, and I think too often we're seeing each piece of that system a siloed discussion. Settler violence is the topic, but it's not just about the violence. Look at everything else that is happening. This is a full picture of de facto annexation, ethnic cleansing, mass displacement, forced displacement. If this continues at this pace, in 5 years, 10 years, as a Palestinian, I am terrified to think about what will be left for us if there's no intervention. And it seems like nothing is coming.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Phil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified for when a new episode drops. You can find the link in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.